I have told the world, oftener than once, that longitude is not to be found by watchmakers, but by the ablest astronomers. I am unwilling to meddle with any other method than the right one.
Newton really prejudiced the board by saying in no uncertain terms that no clock would ever succeed in finding the longitude.
Working in isolation, John Harrison never heard Newton's doubts, and the labor to perfect his clocks went on. He now needed to check the accuracy of his timekeepers to within seconds a day, but the village sundial wasn't good enough.
Harrison quite simply looked at the stars, but there were no time standards whatsoever. But it's quite possible to get to take star readings. As the world rotates, the fixed stars come into your vision every day at a certain time, but they arrive 3 minutes, 54 seconds earlier every day. And Harrison managed to take sightings from his house.
I fashioned a true way of setting my clocks by the apparent motion of the fixed stars with a very large sort of an instrument, about 25-yard radius, composed of the west side of my neighbour's chimney and the east side of my own window frames, by which the rays of a star are taken from my sight almost in an instant, and counting the seconds of the clock beginning a little before the star vanish, and so I observe at what second it vanisheth.
John Harrison's living room had become a genuine scientific laboratory.
If this was a period of scientific revolution, Harrison was a real revolutionary character, a lone genius, totally uncaring about what everyone else was doing. He invented everything he needed.
Of the many factors which could degrade a clock's performance, none was worse than the effect slight changes in temperature had on the speed of the movement.
The pendulum must always retain the same length, but there's no metal whatever whereof to make a pendulum that is not continually altering its length according to the degrees of heat and cold.
Harrison's achievement represents a fundamental issue in science, whether science proceeds by theory or by the hands-on work of an experimenter.
Searching for a pendulum which would not be affected by temperature, Harrison noticed that heat caused brass and iron wires to expand at different rates. Making use of this observation, he combined wires of the two metals to compensate for expansion, producing and perfecting his gridiron pendulum.
He developed testing methods. These clocks were incredibly accurate. He tested one clock against another, which is totally unheard of in his own day.
Two clocks placed, one in one room and the other in another, in very cold and frosty weather. I'll make one room very warm with a great fire, whilst the other is very cold.
He would succeed only when there was absolutely no time difference between the two clocks, whether hot or cold. It was brilliant science, requiring astonishing feats of observation.
And I can stand in the doorstep and I can hear the beats of both pendulums, by which means I can have the difference of both clocks to the 20th part of a second. Less. And thus I prove the operation of my pendulum wires, and adjust the same.
The very thought that you could produce a precision timekeeper for wooden clocks seems quite out of order as well. And yet Harrison claimed that these clocks were accurate within a second a month. This is something that wasn't even thought of until the 1880s. Harrison was 150 years ahead of his time. It was incredible.
By 1730, John Harrison had collected enough information on the effects of temperature, friction, and gravity to convince himself that he could really build a sea clock, accurate and reliable enough to win the longitude prize. For the first time in his life, he ventured beyond the vicinity of Barrow, traveling to London to present his proposal to the esteemed astronomer royal, Dr. Edmund Halley, predictor of the comet which bears his name. Halley arranged an introduction to London's most famous clockmaker, George Graham. After a stay of several weeks, Harrison returned to his village. His journals describe his London adventures and give a glimpse of the country carpenter meeting England's most distinguished scientists. His plain-spoken memoir suggests that he was less than impressed by the work of the celebrated George Graham.
Dr. Halley advised me to go to Mr. Graham. Advice which went very hard with me, for I thought it a step very improper to be taken. But he told me Mr. Graham was a very honest man and would do me no harm as by pirating anything from me. Mr. Graham began, as I thought, very roughly with me, which occasioned me to become rough too. But we got the ice broke. And we reasoned the cases more than once. And our reasoning, as it were sometimes debating, held from about 10 o'clock in the forenoon till 8 o'clock at night. I had along with me some drawings of the principal parts of my pendulum clock, and also my intended timekeeper for the longitude. While Mr. Graham proved indeed a fine gentleman, if truth be told, I was taken aback by the poor little feeble motions of his pendulums. It was a small force they had, like creatures sick and inactive. But I commented not on the folly in his watches.
When Harrison knocked on the door, here was a joiner's son from Lincolnshire with no formal education, and here he was producing plans for a clock with wooden wheels, of all things. You can imagine how Graham must have reacted to that. But there's no doubt that as soon as Harrison got out his drawings of his gridiron pendulum and showed George Graham that, he would have been incredibly impressed, because we know that George Graham had been trying to design just such a temperature-compensated pendulum himself some years before and had failed. So this must have been the turning point for Graham. This was no time waster.
Harrison's meeting with George Graham was indeed a turning point. With Graham's support, development money began to flow, allowing Harrison to build his first longitude timekeeper, the sea clock known today simply as H1. One by one, Harrison attacked the problems of adapting his clocks to go to sea. Working in brass for the first time, he continued to use wheels of oak to engage rollers of lignum vitae. To overcome the motion of the ship, Harrison replaced his long pendulum with 2 rocking balance arms with springs to maintain their oscillations.
And in this way, he got round all of these problems and produced arguably one of the most remarkable marine timekeepers of all time.
In 1736, Harrison accompanied his first sea clock on a preliminary testing voyage to Lisbon on board the Centurion. The stormy 5-week journey was to be the only ocean trip of John Harrison's life.
On the return voyage from Lisbon, there were storms and the ship lost its position. The crew kept a rough idea of where the ship was by dead reckoning. Harrison was maintaining its location as best he could by the timekeeper. And when land was sighted, the south coast of England was sighted, there was a dispute as to what point of land it was. They knew they were not far from the Scilly Isles, where Sir Cloudesley Shovel's fleet had been wrecked. As land got closer, the crew realized that Harrison was right. His timekeeper was proved to be a practical invention.